officially come out until tomorrow. And you're hearing it here first. Of course, he's the son of legendary Waylon Jennings, a friend of the show. His last big album was a hit. And, of course, he did that working with Stephen King, who did original recordings and voiceovers, lengthy ones, because he's a Shooter Jennings fan, for the album. And the reason I like Shooter Jennings is our politics are pretty close. We love liberty, and we don't buy into official constructs or stereotypes. But also because his music's so good. I mean, the last album was Pink Floyd meets the Rolling Stones, meets Waylon Jennings, meets The Doors, meets I don't know what. I mean, just the whole album, every time I listen to it in my car, listen to it on my iPod or on my iPhone, it's just so good. And we're going to play part of Summer of Rage coming up at the start of the next segment from his last album. I know the crew, last time he came through Central Texas, went out and saw him and said it was an amazing show. I was too busy with family to go. ShooterJennings.com, BCRmedia.com, I guess is the record label. And he's the only son of country legend Waylon Jennings and Jesse Coulter. Shooter Jennings literally spent his childhood on a tour bus. And he's born Waylon Albright Jennings, or Shooter. And we've got a poster of his last album hanging up back in my office. So, Shooter, it is good to have you via Skype with us today. Congratulations on the new album, and thanks for rolling it out here on the broadcast, buddy.
Man, thank you so much for having me. You know I love talking to you. I love being on the air. And I tell you what, man, ever since our last talk when I was in there in studio, you wouldn't believe how many people come up to me at shows and even on the street and say that they saw or heard the show, man, and that they loved it, you know. And so I really appreciate it. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, brother. Let's talk about your style of music and, of course, the legend George Jones that died this year. I just kept expecting that guy to live forever. One of the hardest working, hardest drinking guys in show business, but finally reformed himself. I know you were friends with him. Let's talk about George Jones. And you were already doing this album in a tribute to him, I'm told, before he died.
Well, what actually happened is that I didn't start the tribute until after he died. But what had happened is about in 2012, I got an email from a guy who said he was producing George Jones's final record and wondered if I had any music for it. So I don't usually like stockpile songs, so I kind of wrote two of them, one of which I co-wrote with a dear friend of mine, and I sent it to this guy. And it turns out he was not telling the truth, but so I never heard anything back, and then George passed, and then I was digging through my emails, and I ran across the songs, and I was like, man, these things are actually pretty good, and, I think that people would dig to hear them, and so I recorded them, and it just kind of, then I started doing a couple of the covers, and it just kind of turned into like a whole, extended play record of just covers and the two originals. So, man, George was like, there's not very many people that I've met in this music business that don't get so sidetracked by their own worth and fame and stuff. And George was one of those guys that always was really humble and always really sweet to me. And, growing up as a kid, it went a long ways that he looked at me like a real person and not just like some, kid running around the house he didn't care about when I was little. So he was a very kind-hearted man, and when I did my first record, he came in and sang a little on it and stuff. And it was really, he was when I asked him to do it, he just said yes and did it and came and was just so awesome. And I don't know, he was just such a good person, man. And that's not only that, he was the greatest country singer of all time, if not the greatest singer of all time.
Well, let's talk about George Jones, because I grew up, some of my earliest memories, 2, 3, 4 years old. My mom would listen to rock and roll. So would my dad, Beatles, all that stuff. But we would listen to country music. And, of course, we would listen to all the classic stuff like George Jones, but then also outlaw stuff that was just getting big in the mid-'70s with your dad, of course, people like his good friend Willie Nelson. So, I mean, let's talk about George Jones and you as a child through a child's eyes on tour, but at his house, your dad being friends with him, I guess, who the real George Jones was.
Man, I knew, it's funny because as a kid, I didn't really witness any of the, some of his battles so much. I mean, maybe if I did, I don't remember. I just remember him being around a lot, him and Tony Joe White. Willie lived in Texas and a lot of those guys. But so as far as like the Nashville kind of side of things where I grew up, George was around a lot. And you're around, like you have your dad's friends, you know. To a little kid, it's about the same. But as you start getting older and start realizing who George Jones is and the importance of him and how talented he is. And then when you finally in your life get your heart broken by some mean old woman for the first time and you actually understand these drinking songs.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like when it finally hits you, you're like, good God, like listen to that voice and those songs. I mean, it's just so powerful. So like by the time that I was getting older and I kind of got a chance to be around him again, it was like I was starstruck, you know, even though I'd been around him my whole life. But he was always one of those guys, man. It's like he would, like there was I mean, I can give you a bunch of examples, but there's been times that I'd seen him out and he was performing that night, and like him and his wife Nancy would welcome me on his bus and he'd give me a big hug and they just ask how I was doing and want to talk and stuff, you know, and all I'm sitting there doing is being like, man, I can't believe I didn't know for the first 18 years of my life that you were this guy. You know what I mean? So, I mean, it's one of those things where I was just so proud of the fact that I was able to call him a friend later in life, and he was just such a kind-hearted person that doing a tribute to him came very easily to me, you know.
How did he get the nickname Old Possum?
Because he got a reputation of not showing up. You know, they call him No Show Jones, and so he was playing possum. There were a lot of gigs in the 70s and 80s and stuff where he wouldn't show up at the gigs, so he got the nickname.
Yeah, that's what I'd heard, but sometimes, you know, you hear it secondhand. Just like I'd heard secondhand, you know, why you did this record, and it was pretty close, but not exactly accurate. But you know, I guess in later years he got better about showing up, but I guess he liked to get hammered sometimes.
Oh yeah, I mean he had you know, he had a lot of demons to battle there, and he won, and that's so hard because, you know, it's one thing when you're doing things that are, you know, you're a crooked guy or something and you're hurting other people and stuff like that. It's one kind of a character attribute, and with a guy like George, you know, he was only hurting himself with that, and I think that was kind of the ultimate battle for him. But man, I mean, if you ever heard that song, the Choices off the Cold Hard Truth, man, what a great song. I remember in the 90s when that came out, hearing that was when I really first started falling in love with country music, and I heard that Choices, and it was so heavy.
So even though your dad was, you know, one of the country music legends and is Waylon Jennings, you didn't really start falling in love with it till you tuned into the really deep stuff from George Jones.
Yeah, George and Hank Jr. and a lot of those guys, and a lot of Willie's songwriting. I mean, I love my dad's music, but that was kind of a comfort thing. But I mean, it really wasn't until I started, you know, as a kid, I loved rock and roll so much because there's energy and there's all this thing, you know, there's this kind of like power and angst to it. But like like I said, when you kind of live enough that you start understanding what, you know, like Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain, when that's like something powerful, you know, or like He Stopped Loving Her Today, when you start realizing the emotion behind these songs.
What's the name of the Johnny Cash song? We played it earlier where he says, you know, lay there in your bed and keep your mouth shut till I'm gone. You don't know till you grow up and that girlfriends or whatever, or wives or whatever, get mad and then lay in the bed all day yelling at you. You know, sometimes I read that happens. The whole point is that until you're a man and been through that, then you don't even get the music, just like you said earlier.
It's very true, man. It's very true, you know, and I'm a prime example of that, having grown up around this music, you know. But there was a point in time for me, for sure, when I finally got it. And I mean, all the other rock and roll stuff I used to listen to seemed so dumb after that, because you saw these big men on stage singing these beautiful love songs that were like so heavy. You know, there was nothing more manly than that.
I agree with you. Tell us about the hat you're wearing. Radio viewers can't, radio listeners can't see it like TV viewers. I guess this show could be called Radio Viewers. We ought to grab some names along those lines right now since I said it. But it says Repent, Shooter Jennings.
Yeah, it does. It is actually, there's a band called Those Poor Bastards out of up north that I love very much, to play kind of interesting kind of country music. And my buddy Blake Judd gave me this hat, but I love it all the time. You know, like I listen to your show when we're all the time, and especially when I'm on the road. And lately, like, I mean, right now we're in such a hotbed of like, you know, where there's like taboos